And welcome to the Reasoning Theology Show, everyone. I'm your host, Michael Lofton, Monday evening, joined by contributor Louis Dizon, and we're going to do a show here on the Book of Leviticus, continuing the R&T Scripture series that we've been doing. Louis, how are you? It's good to have you back on.
Oh, it's been great. So things are getting pretty cold at this point. So
Yeah.
yeah, I've just been spending a lot of my time just working on my PhD work as
Yeah.
well as trying to do some Bible study to do this series.
You making some good progress in the PhD?
Oh yeah, I have about 89, 90-ish pages worth of notes done.
Good. Of
Like the
notes,
final,
not of actual the writing, but just of notes.
yeah, like it's like a draft.
Yeah.
Um, like hopefully I'll be able to use most, if not all of that when I
Okay.
actually produce the final product.
I see what you're saying. Because I mean, I'm gathering a whole bunch of pages of just notes, and it's not going to be anything that I could just copy and paste and put into the dissertation. It's more just, okay, so and so says this, so and so says that, so and so says that.
Yeah, yeah. I also put my own commentary on it. That way,
Yeah,
that could be included as well.
that's a good idea. That's a really good point. Well, let's go ahead and dive in. We're talking about the Book of Leviticus, and this is, to some people that's going to sound boring, but to me, it's exciting just because I think that Leviticus is a really interesting book, just because of some of the typology involved. But, go ahead and introduce us to the Book of Leviticus. What exactly is it? Why was it written? When was it written? Who do you think the author is? Stuff like that.
Yeah. So as you know, we just finished going through Genesis and Exodus, and in the book of Exodus, we leave off with Moses receiving the law at Mount Sinai. And the book of Leviticus is essentially a continuation of the material that is found um, at the latter half of the book of Exodus, where you have all of the laws. So Leviticus provides us with the legal code that God expects the people of Israel to live by. Now, for authorship, as you know, I tend to be on the more traditional side. I believe that the law as we have it today substantially, if not entirely, goes back to Moses. But if you consult a lot of critical commentaries on the Pentateuch, you'll hear stuff like the documentary hypothesis that will um, attribute these to later authors such as the Yahwist or the Elohist. Um, and I think that if you look at the arguments that are made for why they think that this is later, like you might be able to argue that for like maybe one or two places in the text that seem to imply like maybe a setting that is already in the land of Israel. But for the most part, I think that such a hypothesis is unnecessary, especially if you believe in a God who is able to see hundreds of years into the future and can provide legislation that is relevant for context that is removed from the original Sinai context of Moses and the Israelites.
That requires you to start with a perspective of
Yeah.
faith rather than skepticism, right?
Exactly. Like it makes a big deal if you approach the text with the presupposition that miracles and predictive prophecy are possible or not. Because if you assume in advance that um, miracles and predictive prophecy are not possible, you will look at any indication that the text is speaking to a situation far removed from the original context it's supposed to be in, like the future, and assume that, well, it must actually have been written at that later date. A good example is, we're not at there yet, but in the book of Isaiah, you'll see references to the Babylonian exile and to King Cyrus of Persia freeing the Israelites from exile. And people will look at that and say, well, King Cyrus didn't live until hundreds of years after Isaiah. So this part that talks about him must be written by a Deutero Isaiah who back attributed his writing to the prophet. I mean, I can see why some people think that, but Why can't God speak to a situation that happens hundreds of years later?
One thing that I've always found interesting when it comes to the two Isaiahs is that Jesus quotes from the first Isaiah, and then he says that same Isaiah said, and then he quotes from the second Isaiah.
Yep.
Now,
So,
maybe that he's not giving a commentary on, whether or not it's
uh,
one or two. He's just saying that same Isaiah insofar as that same book of Isaiah that we call Isaiah. Maybe that's what he's saying, but I don't know. To me, it just kind of seems like this is a novel view. This was not something that was traditionally held. And it
yeah,
seems like you said, one of the reasons is because it prophesies certain things and they automatically disqualify that. So it could not have actually been an authentic,
yeah.
prophecy. So let's go ahead and change some of the views here.
Yeah,
So,
well, the idea that maybe the Pentateuch was not entirely written by Moses goes at least as far back as Baruch Spinoza from the, I want to say, 16th or 17th century.
mhm.
So he had a lot of unorthodox views for a Jew, and he ended up being excommunicated by the rabbis. But he made these observations, and they were eventually picked up by later biblical scholars who gave these theories their current form. The other thing that hopefully we'll be able to get into is the idea that um, the laws that are found in the Pentateuch and in Leviticus in particular seem to reflect other ancient Near Eastern law codes, such as the Code of Hammurabi. And if you've taken the time to read the Code of Hammurabi, which is available in the quick text I have here, there are places where there's a direct correlation in terms of the sorts of laws that are written and the sorts of situations that are addressed. And that is, of course, understandable because, many of the same things tend to come up in these ancient Near Eastern societies. Um, like whatever society you live in, you will expect to find things such as rape, murder, theft, property damage, etc. So every society is going to have to come up with some way of um, dealing with those sorts of situations. And a lot of the ancient Near Eastern law codes that are contemporaneous with the Pentateuch do end up resolving these situations in a way that is pretty similar to the way that Leviticus resolves them. Um, Ironically, the Code of Hammurabi is actually a very ancient document. Apparently, it can be dated at least as far back as the 18th century BC, which is funny because depending on what chronology you go by, Moses lived either in the 15th or the 13th century BC, and that means that this law code is actually older than Moses, which means that it would have had plenty of time to spread throughout the ancient Near East and become well known. So it's not that far fetched that Moses, who lived in the Pharaonic court during the first 40-ish years of his life, was exposed to these sorts of law codes, and he may have used them to some extent in formulating the contents of the Pentateuch. I don't think that our view of inspiration necessarily rules that out, but at the same time, by the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, he would be guided to reject anything in those laws that would be unjust and to improve upon the legislation that's found there. It's like an example would be how certain property laws are handled. I was actually noticing that in one of the laws in the Code of Hammurabi, it states that if somebody is caught stealing, the amount that they have to pay back is quite severe. It says here that if a man stole an ox or a sheep or an ass or a pig or a boat, if it belonged to the state, he shall make 30-fold restitution. If it belonged to a private citizen, he shall make 10-fold restitution. If he does not have sufficient to make restitution, he shall be put to death. So I want you to notice a couple of things. First is the rate at which restitution has to be made. 30-fold if it's owned by the state, tenfold if it's owned by a private citizen. Now, if you look at Leviticus, there are restitution laws there as well, but you don't get these kinds of extortionate rates like 30-fold or tenfold. Like in Leviticus chapter 6, verse 5, for example, you have a similar law. But it says here that he shall only restore an extra 1/5 on top of what he stole. So it's much milder in the um, punishment that is inflicted, and also it doesn't make a distinction between state property and private property. The same rate applies regardless to who you stole from, and also nowhere in the book of Leviticus or anywhere else in the Pentateuch do you find any law saying that if someone is unable to make restitution, they will pay with their life. Like, in general, death penalties are never applied in the Pentateuch to property laws. Like, property, like theft or property damage, is generally repaid in kind. You also give back something materially for having damaged or stolen something that is material. You don't pay for it with your life.
Now, do you notice maybe some similarities where it might appear that the Book of Leviticus is borrowing from some material in the Code of Hammurabi?
Like, I don't know if any of this would count as direct borrowing. In fact, it's
Mhm.
hard to quantify what borrowing means. Like, if you had read something at some point and it is influencing you and you're aware of it, does that count as borrowing?
Mhm.
Because you could plausibly make an argument that Moses was aware of some of these laws.
Mhm.
Like, um, some of them are pretty close. For example, um, one of the laws states that if a man steals the young son of another man, he shall be put to death. Well, we know that in the book of Exodus, chapter 21, verse 16, there's a similar law that says that if a man is caught kidnapping or stealing another man, he shall be put to death. So it's very close to each other.
Yeah. Now, maybe what are some other comparisons that can be made with other ancient Near Eastern laws and the Book of Leviticus outside of the Code of Hammurabi? Are there any other
Oh,
comparisons?
like there are a lot of law codes they're out there, such as the Middle Assyrian laws. The one that I only really studied in depth was the um, Code of Hammurabi. Like, I know a little bit about the Middle Assyrian laws because they come up in the context of what the Book of Leviticus has to say about homosexual practice. So there will
Mhm.
be a parallel between the two. Um, but that's the only part of the Middle Assyrian laws that I've actually looked at in detail. And that's actually something that will come up if we touch that tricky subject tonight,
Yeah. Oh,
which
and
we
we will.
most likely will.
Yeah, we definitely will. Now,
Hmm.
what are some of what would you say is the purpose of the law, or the laws that
Right.
we find in the Book of Leviticus? Is there one purpose? Are there multiple purposes?
Well, there are definitely multiple purposes. Like a lot of it has to do with, you know, constituting Israel as a nation, right? Because you have this collection of tribes with a common ancestor, and they have not yet been formed into a. And the purpose of the law is to give shape to that polity, to give them something with which they may be identified by. Um, and the other important thing, of course, is that by obeying these laws, the people of Israel are supposed to act as a sort of witness to the other nations around them. Like, these laws are a representation of God's justice. Now, granted, they've been adapted to the situation and the context in which the Israelites were found in. So some of them, we can't necessarily apply verbatim to another context, but in the situation that they find themselves in God's wisdom, this is the most just thing that they can adhere to. And the hope is by following this law, the people of Israel will show the other nations um, how to live and to appreciate the justice of God. This is actually reflected in the book of Deuteronomy, where it says this. In Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 5 onwards, it says, "Behold, I have taught you statutes and ordinances as the Lord my God commanded me, that you should do them in the land which you are entering and to take possession of it. Keep them and do them, for that will be your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of all the peoples, who, when they hear all these statutes, will say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. For what great nation is there that has a God so near to it as the Lord our God is to us whenever we call upon him? And what great nation is there that has statutes and ordinances so righteous as all this law, which I set before you this day?" So the idea here is that the nations will observe these Torah observant Israelites and say, wow, they have an amazing law code. They must have a really wise God to give them a law like that.
Mm.
And of course, the other important thing that we cannot gloss over is the ceremonial aspect of the law, because as anyone who has attempted to read through the book of Leviticus knows, that a huge portion of it is dedicated towards the temple, or rather the tabernacle, and all the kinds of sacrifices that
Mhm.
are performed in that tabernacle, for all the various reasons that you might need a sacrifice, which usually has to do with sin, but it doesn't necessarily always have to do with sin. Like there are such things as thank offerings, free will offerings, wave offerings that you can do at any time if you're just grateful to God for a situation you find yourselves in. You want to make fellowship with God. Um, but the whole purpose of that sacrificial system is so that the people of Israel can take seriously the sort of um, you know, the holiness of God, if you will. You can't just approach God willy-nilly without having a sacrifice to bring to him. And also, in the case of the sin offering, the fact that blood is spilt is a way for them to recognize how serious their sin is. I actually have a quote here by a medieval rabbi named Nachmanides.
Mhm.
um, he says this about the sacrifices in the Old Testament. He says, all these acts are performed in order that when they are done, a person should realize that he has sinned against his God with his body and his soul, and that his blood should really be spilled and his body burned, were it not for the loving kindness of the Creator. So there's a bit of a substitutionary motif, if you will, there. He's saying that you're the one who should be um, killed and your blood spilt as atonement for your sin, but God has made it so that in your place, this animal may be the one killed and provide that atonement.
What kind of application does that have for us as Christians?
Well, that one is, where we get to the sacrifice of Christ. And the most direct application of that would be the Epistle to the Hebrews, especially if you read chapters 8 through 10 of the book of Hebrews. It talks about, it goes into great detail about the sacrificial system. It doesn't, you know, it doesn't recapitulate every detail, but gives you like a summary of it. And it says that, that sacrificial system that God gave in Leviticus is meant to be sort of like a typology or like a foreshadowing of the final sacrifice that Jesus gives, that is perfect in the sense that it doesn't have to be done over and over again the same way the animal sacrifice in Leviticus have to be, and it doesn't have any blemish because Jesus is perfect and he is sinless. And the it provides it actually removes our sin. Like the sacrifices in Leviticus, they avert God's wrath from us, but they're not really described as taking away our sin. They're just there so that God may um, avert his avert his wrath from the people of Israel until the final sacrifice can be provided.
That's a really good point, and I'm tempted to dive into the aspect there of God and wrath. But I want to ask you a question here about some of the hard laws. For example, slavery. You look at Leviticus 25:44 through 46. It talks about how your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. Verse 46, you can make them slaves for life, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. But you can make slaves from the other nations for life. So I don't think the year of jubilee that they have where they release their Israelite slaves, I don't think that applies to them. But correct me if I'm
Mm.
wrong. But what's going on here when it comes to slavery? It seems unjust.
Yeah. Well, first of all, we need to define the institution of slavery as it exists in the Israelite context. Now, for those who know Hebrew, the verbal form avad, from which we get the noun eved, has a very broad semantic range. It has to do with serving, worshiping, you know, giving homage, um, anything that anything that involves acknowledging someone who is in a superior state and serving them. So so a slave or an eved in an Old Testament context involves a lot more different types of things than a slave in like a 19th century American or European context with African slaves, because that's a very specific kind of slavery. That's chattel slavery, and funny enough, that sort of slavery is illegal according to the Pentateuch because it involves kidnapping, and it says in Exodus that kidnapping is not allowed. And if you look at the sorts of slavery that was practiced in Israel, a lot of it was a means of providing for the person who is in servitude. Like a lot of the times, these people voluntarily go into it as a means of making sure that they are able to have food and a place to live. Um, so so it's not something that people are generally forced into. It's usually something that people willingly put themselves into for economic reasons. And you mentioned that there is that jubilee. Now, actually, I've read some commentaries that differ on that and say that the jubilee does also apply to um, the foreign slaves. Maybe um, misread it somewhere, but as far as I know, even foreign slaves have the opportunity to free themselves. If they're able to um, raise up sufficient capital to purchase their own freedom, theoretically, they could do that. So, so there is a way out for people who do not want to permanently be in that situation, which is something that doesn't really apply in like the American Southern context.
Hmm. Do you think that the relationship between the slave master and the slave in the Old Testament was what we often hear, more the relationship between a boss and a worker, or do you think that that's not fair?
In some situations, it is like that. Like, um, like there is a contractual element to it, of course, and um, there, it may be permanent if the slave chooses to. There is provision for that, and maybe temporary. But generally, if you look at the sorts of master-slave relationships that are presented in Leviticus, they're not really, much harsher than a lot of contexts that we find ourselves in the modern day. Um, I mean, you could argue. I mean, so I've heard people argue this that in some ways, some of these master-slave relationships have more protections built into them than some of the unregulated economies that exist in the world today. Maybe not in our specific context, but think about something like China or India, where you have little children in sweatshops.
Mm.
Um, like like something like comparing the Old Testament example to something like that. You could see that the Old Testament has greater concern for making sure that um, the treatment of slaves or servants is not unduly harsh.
Mm. Now, are there any other hard laws that you've come across that people today, their sensibilities would have difficulty with in the Book of Leviticus, other than the slavery laws?
Well, um, I know some people will occasionally gawk at the fact that a woman, if she gives birth to a baby girl, has a purification period that is twice as long as if uh, the child is a boy. So, I'm trying to find the specific passage, but the if the woman gives birth to a male, the purification period is about 7 days, whereas if it's a girl, then the purification period is twice that. It's like 14 days. And some people think, oh, is Leviticus teaching that girls are more unclean than boys? Um, Actually, like I've heard a lot of explanations for why. Um, the girl has a longer purification period than the boy. That does not necessitate believing that women are somehow filthier than men. It could be the fact that um, baby girls, for example, are more prone to like demonic attacks than boys, and that is um, something that is taken into account by the law. Or it could be that the baby girl has some sort of like discharge of her own. That's something that I think Paul Copan has brought up in Is God a Moral Monster as an explanation for why a newborn baby, um, if she's a girl, has a cleansing period that is twice as long. By the way, just a plug for a book. Paul Copan's book Is God a Moral Monster? Making Sense of the Old Testament God is a great resource for dealing with a lot of these hard laws. And in fact, a lot of the explanation that I provide actually come from him. So I would totally recommend that resource.
What would you say about some who read the book of Leviticus and they come across the dietary laws and they just think this is weird? It doesn't
Yeah.
make
Uh,
sense. What's going on there?
Before we get to that, I just want to quickly answer the question that's in the chat box. If a
Sure.
slave has children, are the slaves also slaves? Yes, they are. If a female slave is, has a child, then the children are also generally considered slaves. Although, again, you have to remember that Jubilee laws apply here, so they're not going to be perpetually in that state. Um, they're eventually going to be freed as well, assuming that the law where a man voluntarily chooses to become a slave for life is not taking effect at this point. So that's something to put into consideration as well. But anyway, back into the other thing that you mentioned. What was it again?
The dietary laws.
Ah, yes. So there are many reasons that people have posited for why these dietary laws are there. And so a lot of the times you have to realize that um, unfortunately the exact reason why these laws are provided for us is not given. Maybe the people to whom they were originally given would have understood it intuitively, but because we're not on that context, we don't understand it anymore. But a lot of those dietary laws, people might say something like, well, it was for hygienic purposes, like seafood and pork are extra prone to bacterial infection. That's why God forbade them. That's not really a sufficient explanation, because if that was the case, then why is that law not relevant to our context? You would think that if that was true back then, it would be just as true now. Also, I don't think it's necessarily unique to the types of animals that are prohibited in the Pentateuch. Like any animal theoretically could be a vector for disease, not just seafood or camels or pigs. So it has to be more than that. Um, and some people also think that it has to do with the fact that these animals are used in pagan rituals, and some of them are. But the problem with that explanation is that some of the animals that are not prohibited were also used, like cattle and goats were used in pagan rituals as well, and those were not prohibited. So if you look at some of the commentaries on the kosher laws, a lot of the explanations have to do with um, like making boundary distinctions. You know, like for example, the whole thing about the split hooves and chewing cud. What is the reason for pigs um, being prohibited? Is because they do not have split hooves and they do not chew the cud. Or sorry, they chew the cud but do not have split hooves. Um, Cattle, on the other hand, they do um, chew cud, but they don't have split hooves, and because of that, they are, not transgressing an ontological boundary that um, has been set up by the law. Which, it sounds strange to us in our context, but to the Israelites, whom God was building up to be a separate people, these sorts of boundary divisions were intended to communicate to them that they are a separate, distinct people from the rest of the nations that lived around them. So the kosher laws acted as a sort of object lesson for them. It doesn't have to do with these animals being, inherently unclean, but they are ritually unclean for purposes of the covenant that God has placed the people in.
Yeah, I've come away thinking kind of the same thing. There's nothing specifically inherent about
Yeah,
them that is unclean, but God was just giving some boundaries to
yeah.
establish the concept of ritual purity and ritual cleanliness. Um, what do you make of things like mixing fabric and clothing? Mixing different fabrics, that this is an abomination, and
Yeah.
what's going on there?
So so you notice a lot of these laws, right? Do not mix seeds, do not mix fabrics. Like one of the things that they have in common is the concept of mixing things that should not be mixed. And this builds right into that theory that a lot of interpreters have that these ceremonial laws were meant to act as sort of object lessons for why the Israelites should not mix with the peoples around them.
Yeah.
Just as you are not to mix two different types of fabric in your clothing, so you are not to mix with the Gentile nations who may pollute you with their practices.
Yeah, so there's nothing inherently wrong, it's just more of an
Yeah,
object lesson.
exactly.
And what
Like
what's
it's
wrong with, the Israelites mixing with non-Israelites? What's the danger there?
Well, a lot of it has to do with the practices that these people have. Like over and over again, you read in the laws that one of the dangers that mixing with other peoples has is that you will inevitably start assimilating their culture, their laws, their religion. You'll end up bowing to their gods. And you see that in the rest of the Old Testament if you
Mhm.
go through First and Second Kings, or goodness, you don't have to go that far. Just the Book of Numbers, that trap gets sprung already, where some of the Israelites mess around with Moabite women, and that results in idolatry, and God sends a plague upon them as punishment for that. So over and over again, there is this danger that is identified of um, foreign contact resulting in a compromise with paganism and with idolatry. Of course, we recognize as well that this is not an absolute danger in the sense that you will inevitably fall into idolatry anytime you mix with a stranger. And the great example of that is the book of Ruth. Ruth was a Moabite, but she made a pledge at the beginning of the book that she would adopt the religion of the Israelites when she enters the land, and she will not bring any of the detestable practices of her people in her. And because of that, there was no problem with her marrying an Israelite man and becoming part of the lineage of the Davidic kings.
When you look through the book of Leviticus, in one sentence, we're talking about mixing fabrics, which, again, there's nothing inherently wrong with it. In the next sentence, we're talking about something that appears to be morally, inexcusable. So, is it the case that some laws are just kind of interwoven together so that in one minute you're reading about something it's not morally wrong, and in another second you're reading about something that is morally wrong, and they're not to be conflated as if the mixing of fabrics is equal to committing adultery? What do you
Yeah,
think?
well, that's the tricky part with exegeting the book of Leviticus or the Pentateuch as a whole, is that we recognize that there are different classes of laws here. That's pretty intuitive. The hard part is trying to like distinguish them, you know, like, okay, thou shalt not murder, that's pretty clearly a moral category. Thou shalt not eat shellfish, that's clearly a ceremonial category. We get that. But you get something like, the Sabbath, right? That seems to, in some ways, be a mix of both, because on the one hand, the Sabbath is found in the Ten Commandments. And Ten Commandments we generally think of as moral. So the fact that the Sabbath is placed there means that, there's an element to the Sabbath that can't be reduced to merely um, ceremonial um, precepts. And, we recognize this as Catholics because we still teach the relevance of the Ten Commandments in the Christian life. And the Catechism has a whole section on the relevance of the Sabbath law in our context. Now, we don't celebrate in the exact same way that the Jews celebrate it, but a lot of the general principles that undergird the Sabbath still apply to us today. That being said, there's obviously a lot of elements to the Sabbath law that were only meant for the Israelites and their context and are not meant to be carried over today. Like, I don't think, for example, that um, people today would be put to death for gathering sticks on the Sabbath day. At least, I don't think anyone has ever argued that that's something that we should be still doing today. Um, I don't know. If I search the internet hard enough, I might bump into someone who thinks that. But generally speaking, that's not a view that we would take today, because we recognize that there is that element in the Sabbath that is, ceremonial and only applicable to the Israelites as a way of showcasing their distinctness as a people.
I think you're right. If we spent maybe 5 minutes online, we'd find somebody
Yep.
that said that that's wrong. Uh, all right,
Mm.
so here's the big question, right? The one that everybody wants to have addressed, and that is the sexual laws. Especially, let's start with the biggest one, the ones
Yeah.
concerning homosexuality. What's going on there? Are they still applicable?
Yeah.
Let's engage that.
So here's the thing, right? Um, a lot of the like liberal argumentation for why we should not regard the prohibition for homosexuality as applicable today has to do with the assumption that it was a ceremonial law rather than a moral one, right? So you'll often hear, like, in a discussion with people saying, "Oh, you don't follow the law that says you shouldn't eat shellfish or you shouldn't mix fabrics. So why should we care about the law that says that man shall not lie with another man?" Which is, a very crude form of argumentation, but happens a lot on the internet. But there's a more sophisticated version of the argument that undergirds it, and it goes something like this. So the liberal argument is that whenever something is referred to as a toeva, or abomination that has to do with a ceremonial rather than a moral category, and of course, the term toeva is used to refer to the man lying with another man. And because of that, we can infer that this is something that was meant to be a ceremonial category. And it is similar to the laws that are mentioned about not mixing fabrics or eating shellfish that are, designed to avoid a um, mixing of boundaries. But uh, just as it was an object lesson not to prohibit something that is necessarily intrinsically wrong, so is the prohibition against male homosexuality not necessarily intended to be a prohibition of something that is intrinsically wrong, but just something that to showcase the separateness of the people of Israel. There's also a sub argument attached to that saying that what is really being um, prohibited here is like male cult prostitution, because we know from ancient Near Eastern religion that that's something that happened a lot. And by prohibiting a man lying with a man, the sort of thing that the Israelites were also actually trying to get rid of was the danger of male cult prostitution. So that's the argument in a nutshell for why more liberal theologians think this law does not apply to them. Now,
In the New
if you
Testament, of
want to
course.
know
Also.
the
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
yeah, now if you want to know the more detailed response to that argument, there's a book by Robert Daniel, which is the sort of um, most important book you can have on this topic, called the Bible and Homosexual Practice. He goes into great detail on all of the texts in the Bible that are relevant to this topic in some way or another.
Yeah.
And and I think anybody who deals with this topic on a regular basis should have this book. But I'm going to try to summarize the argument based on what is contained here. So, first of all, the idea of male homosexuality is, of course, something that comes up in other law codes other than the Israelite one. But there's an interesting contrast. Like the Jewish law, the Pentateuch, is actually the most stringent of all the ancient law codes when it comes to the topic of male homosexuality. Like um, the Middle Assyrian laws, which I alluded to, do prohibit certain forms of male homosexual contact. For example, because we're talking about a stratified society, like an upper class nobleman cannot be penetrated by someone who is more lower class than him. So there's this idea that the penetrator is inherently supposed to be somebody of a higher social class than the penetrated one. And also, um, for those who study classical history, you know that ancient Greeks had pederasty, and that was sort of like an accepted practice among them. It was seen as a way of like teaching authority to the young boys, but um, as time goes on, of course, they are weaned out of that practice. The ancient Israelite law is unique in the sense that its prohibition of male homosexual contact is unqualified. Like it just says right out, a man shall not lie with a man as with a woman. It doesn't say, unless the man being penetrated is a lower class, or it doesn't say that, if this is in a context of cult prostitution. It doesn't make any of those sorts of qualifiers. It just gives you a blanket prohibition of the practice. And I don't think that you can simply reduce it to ceremonial laws, because look at the context in which it's found. Like if you go to Leviticus chapter 18, there are a whole set of laws that have to do with prohibited sexual practices. The RSV Second Catholic Edition actually has a header starting at verse 6. It says, Laws concerning sexual relations. All right. Now take a look at some of the laws that are found here. You have prohibitions for incest. You have prohibitions of, rape. You have prohibitions of bestiality. These are the sorts of laws that Leviticus chapter 18 is covering. And of course, smack dab right in the middle of all of that is the prohibition for male homosexuality. It's in verse 22. You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. Right after that, you shall not lie with any beast and defile yourself with it. Neither shall any woman give herself to a beast to lie with it. It is perversion. In the mind of the author of Leviticus, these are all part of the same category of laws. So if we believe that the category of laws as a whole is still applicable today, and there are a few people who want to argue that it isn't, but for the most part, the society still think it is, then it seems incongruous to say that verse 22, in contradistinction to all the verses that come before and after it, is purely ceremonial and only intended for that specific context. Are you tracking the argument so far?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. The other thing to note is that the word toeva, which, according to the liberal argument, only applies to only applies specifically to ceremonial violations. If you actually do a search for toeva in all the different contexts that it occurs throughout the Old Testament, it is used for both moral and ceremonial violations. Like, for example, in the book of Ezekiel, the word toeva is used quite a bit, and it's used to refer to like economic injustices, like oppressing the poor. That's called toeva. Now, that's not a moral category. Sorry, that's not a ceremonial category. That's a moral category. So you can't say that just because something is referred to as a toeva that it's making a ceremonial claim. You have to look at the context. And I think that if you look at Leviticus 18 through 20 in its context, it is clearly presenting homosexuality in the context of moral rather than ceremonial law. And of course, as Christians, the final, kicker for us when it comes to this is the fact that we interpret the Old Testament in light of the New Testament. And if you look at the Old Testament, it clearly lays aside a lot of the laws that were only meant for the people of Israel. It lays aside kosher laws. It lays aside animal sacrifices. It lays aside mixing fabrics. It doesn't say that we're still bound to those things today. What does it say we're still bound to do? We're still bound to the Ten Commandments, for example. We're still bound to, treat the poor well. That is moral, not merely ceremonial. And of course, if you read Romans chapter 1, 1 Corinthians chapter 6, etc., St. Paul is quite clear that the law prohibiting homosexuality is still applicable in his day, in the New Covenant context. And an important thing to note is that if you read Romans chapter 1, St. Paul covers both male and female homosexuality, which is a very important thing to note when you're reading Leviticus, because a lot of the rabbis who read Leviticus believe that only applied to male on male homosexuality. They believe that lesbianism was not covered by the law. And there's a whole complicated theory as to why that is. It had to do with the fact that no seed is being spilled in the case of lesbianism. So they thought that, we punish male homosexuals, but female homosexuals, we'll let it slide, or maybe I'll give them a slap on the wrist, but you won't put them to death, as it says in Leviticus chapter 20. This is very different from the reasoning that St. Paul gives in Romans, where he lumps both forms together into one.
Which is a very good point because he talks about the women there, Romans 1:26, and of course First
Yeah.
Corinthians, also talks about it, but it's explicit there in Romans 1.
Yep.
Very good point.
Yeah.
Now, unless you had any further comments there, I wanted to get to the Day of Atonement. Anything else that you wanted to comment on there before we move on?
Yeah. Well, all I have to say is this actually brings me back to the thing that happened in the school board where
Yeah.
somebody, one of the trustees got in trouble for making that comparison. Funny enough, that comparison goes right back to the Bible, as we can see right here. So it's very hard to lampoon someone making that connection without lampooning sacred scripture as a whole. Um, but that's my last comment on the matter.
Yeah. Now, let's talk a little bit about Leviticus 16, the Day of Atonement. Can you tell us what exactly is it, and how is it maybe applicable to the work of Jesus and maybe some of the typology involved? Any comments there?
Yeah, so the Day of Atonement is the big sacrificial day that is observed by the Israelites. So they have all sorts of like atoning sacrifices that are performed throughout the year. But Yom Kippur is the big one. Like this is meant to be like the general atonement that is applicable to the whole nation of Israel, and it involves two things. It involves a goat that is sent away into the wilderness, and then involves another animal that is killed and is, the blood is sprinkled on the altar in the most holy place. And the both of those represent something. Like the scapegoat that is released into the wilderness represents um, the fact that the sins of the Israelites are cast far away from the people, so that God will remember them no more. Whereas the one animal that is killed and is its blood is sprinkled on the altar, that one serves as a representation of the fact that sin is a serious business. It brings about death. It brings about um, you know the spilling of blood, and the whole imagery of slaughter is meant to convey that. Going back to the quote by Nachmanides that I quoted at the beginning, he says that uh, you're supposed to think of yourself as the one who should have died instead, but God in His grace has ordained that this animal will be the one whose blood will be spilled instead of yours. Um, and of course, that whole motif of blood making atonement for sin is very important for us Christians, because um, that is the typology that points forward to the sacrifice of Christ. Think about the terms that are used for Jesus in the New Testament. He's called the Lamb that takes away the sin of the world. So um, and it's said that by the blood of Christ that we are cleansed of all of our sins. And if you go to the book of Hebrews, it says that almost nothing is cleansed except with blood. So the sacrifice of Christ in the New Testament fulfills a function that is similar to the function of the animal sacrifices that happen in Yom Kippur, but it's much greater in scope, because the because Yom Kippur is only meant really for the people of Israel, right? But when Jesus is sacrificed, it's for the sins of the whole world. So it is greater in that. It's also more perfect in the sense of the fact that He is sacrificed once, and you don't need multiple animals to be sacrificed, because Jesus by Himself is sufficient.
One thing I also wanted to mention here while we're talking about it, as far as the Day of Atonement, is the Talmud talks about how they would do is they'd have this ribbon put on the door of the temple, and it would be red whenever they go and send out the goat that's mentioned there in Leviticus 16. Whenever
Yeah.
they would send it out to the wilderness, if God accepted the sacrifice, the ribbon would miraculously turn white. And it did every year up until right around the time that Jesus was crucified. And from that point on, it did not turn white any longer.
Yep.
Are you familiar with that? Any comments there?
Uh, I I may have heard it at some point. It's not something that I have looked into in any great depth, but I do know that in the Jewish tradition there is this general idea that God was accepting our sacrifices up to a certain point, and then after that point, God was no longer accepting them. And this took place during the first century. And um, I think the big thing that is hard to miss is the fact that shortly after Jesus died, the second temple was destroyed, and they have not been able to rebuild it since.
Hmm.
And the Jews have had to restructure everything after the second temple was destroyed. Like, they still practice Yom Kippur, but there's no longer any animal sacrifice involved. Like, they just do prayer and fasting instead. Um, and they hope that perhaps God will recognize that and accept it, just as He had accepted the animal sacrifices in the past. Now, of course, there are Jews that want to rebuild the temple, and there's a whole, that's no small source of controversy in the Middle
Right.
East today. And one of the problems is that a lot of Christians are in on the act. Christian Zionists, dispensationalists, they want to help the Jews rebuild the temple. But, for a Christian who understands how redemptive history works, there's no point to rebuilding that temple, because why do we need it? We already have Christ's sacrifice, and that's already final.
Yeah.
Like, for the temple to be rebuilt and for sacrifice to be reinstituted, that just sort of spits in the face of the sacrifice of Christ.
Yeah.
So,
I
like,
think it'd be contrary to Hebrews 6. I think
yep,
that's what's
yep,
going on there with that sin that cannot be
yeah,
forgiven. So, yeah. And one other thing before we move on and get to some of these chat questions. And if y'all want, go ahead and put them in the chat. Make sure to send it to at Reason and Theology. Um, when they send these two goats out, scapegoats, one is sent out into the wilderness. There's some textual variance here, but I found it easy and interesting, and I wanted to know if you had any comments here. In one reading it says that he is to cast lots for the two goats, one for the Lord and the other for the scapegoat. But then some variants put it, and Aaron shall cast lots over the two goats, one for the Lord and the other for Azazel,
yeah.
which is a figure
So,
that you find in First Enoch.
yeah,
So what's going on there?
here's the thing, right? Azazel is what it actually says in the Hebrew, and what does Azazel mean? We are not entirely sure. Some
Hmm.
people think that there's a demon out in the wilderness,
Hmm.
and the goat, when it's sent out, is essentially being sent out to this demon.
Hmm.
Um, that's just one of the theories that people
Hmm.
have of what Azazel means, right? People who are not sure what Azazel means, they will try to give it their best guess, and people's best guess for a long time was, that it means scapegoat, or they will simply just put Azazel, and then they're gonna not bother to explain and say, yeah, we don't know what it
Right.
is. We're just gonna transliterate it.
Right. So
Yeah, but
it's
scapegoat is our best guess as to what it means. It's an
yeah.
imperfect guess, but it's the best we have.
Yeah. Now, um, meaning of Catholic Timothy Flanders is in the chat. He has a great question here. Let me pull it up here. How does the Mishnah and Talmud justify the interpretation of Zakkai and setting aside the Aaronic priesthood via Haggai in view of the legal force of Leviticus? And I think he clarifies here. Sorry, I think Zakkai justified it by Hosea, not Haggai. Any
Yeah,
comments there?
yeah, I'm not too familiar with that specific one. Um, like, all I know is that the fact that there is no temple
Mm,
has led the rabbinic Jews to try to find some sort of way to compensate for that, and then um, they will try to, rationalize it in
right.
some way. So a lot of these rationalizations, you have to understand, are, way after the fact. Like, the Mishnah was compiled right around the third century. So there was a century and a half in between the destruction of the temple and the compilation of these laws. So a lot of, thinking was done in that time period to try to explain, why are we doing it this way.
Yeah, and Timothy brings up a good point here. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. This is something that, of course, is quoted from the Old Testament, but Jews today tend to use that as their explanation for why there's no longer a temple. They'll say that, well, these things weren't really permanent. It's more that God desires mercy, not sacrifice. And so there's really no need for a temple. Really, what God is looking for is prayer and stuff like that, fasting.
Mhm.
And so that's what he calls us to today. So you mentioned how they had to radically reform their views of the Old Testament after the destruction of the temple. That's generally how they tend to justify it. Any comments there? What do you think?
Yeah. So, in a sense, Christians agree. Like, remember, the atonement sacrifices and the ceremonial laws were, in a way, pictures, right? Typologies. And they were never meant to be permanent. They were meant to point forward to something that's greater than them. And we understand that. And Jesus did ultimately do away with that in the new covenant. The issue, though, is with the Jews, they believe that the Messiah has not come yet, right?
Hmm.
So they believe that they're still in the same covenant or the same dispensation as they were when the when the law was revealed. So in order for them to justify changing everything up, they have to find some sort of divine stamp of approval for this.
Hmm.
And we have that as Christians with Jesus in the New Testament. But what do the Jews have to justify their changing of the dispensation? They would need to provide some sort of like revelation, to where they can point to God's saying, "Okay, you did it this way, but now we're going to change it up." And they don't have that, which is the problem with Judaism. The rabbis have basically arrogated to themselves the authority to unilaterally declare changes where God never authorized it.
I would also suggest that everybody read Josephus's account of the destruction of the temple. It's also there in Eusebius, but he's a lot later. I would
Yeah.
actually suggest read Josephus because he's a Jew, of course. So this is coming from a
Mhm.
Jew. And read some of the stuff that was going on while the temple was being destroyed. They're testifying themselves. Josephus, a Jew, is testifying that um, this was God's judgment for something that they had done. So
Yeah.
maybe ask yourself what happened right before the destruction of the temple that this might be judgment for, and you might come to some interesting conclusions there. Any comments there about Josephus and his account of the destruction
Yeah.
of the temple while we're at it?
It's definitely the best source that you can find. And you mentioned Eusebius, but really Eusebius just copy paste Josephus.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
it's really the same account.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, he is just copying and pasting. It's the same thing. So
yeah.
I think just go ahead and read Josephus. It's a little more extensive. And then, of course, you're reading it from a Jew and not from Christians. But it's really interesting the thing that he notes what was going on there. Voices in the sky, God, leaving the temple saying, we will depart from here for there. I forget the exact words, but from now we're departing, we're leaving the temple, something to that effect. Wonder why. Well, there's one more question here. Can you ask Lewis about the Amin sect?
I have no
Any
idea what
comments?
you're talking about.
I haven't. It sounds familiar, but I haven't really looked into it. So, I mean, I would try to throw some comments out there too, but unfamiliar offhand. So, if you could maybe clarify in the chat. Um,
Mm.
Trying to see if there was any other questions. If not, we'll go ahead and end the stream here. Do you have any? Oh, wait. Well, no, it's the same question. Do you
Yeah.
have any concluding thoughts here on the book of
Uh,
Leviticus? Any parting words?
yeah, well, this they say Leviticus is the book of the Bible where a lot of Bible reading plans come to die
Right.
because of all the details.
Right.
I think that if you think about the fact that there is a lot of important things found in Leviticus and how, especially if you're involved in apologetics in any sort of way, you actually need to know these details. I think that will motivate you to read it and try to plow through some of the denser passages. And remember that ultimately it all points to Christ, right? All that
Right.
sacrifices, all that blood, all those rituals, they're meant to provide us with with a foreshadowing of the greater sacrifice that has been made for us in the New Testament.
Point well made. I highly recommend everybody grab Origin's commentary on Leviticus. Sometimes it goes too far. Sometimes it's too fanciful in its
Mhm.
allegory. But sometimes he has some really good insights and good points and
Yeah,
typology there and how it
yeah.
points to Christ and his
People
sacrifice.
say Origin goes
Yeah.
too far with the allegories, but he strikes something very important, which is that ultimately all points towards Jesus.
And so I
Um,
substantially agree with him in his commentary, but in some parts I'm just thinking, man, you're reading too far into this. This is too far. But I like what he's doing and what he's trying to do, and I think that there's a lot of merit to what he's saying. It's just at some points I think he takes it a little too far. But that's just my opinion. You read it for yourselves and see what you think. Well worth reading. The Church Fathers on sacred scripture. And I know Origen's not a church father technically. Anyways, Lewis, I appreciate you coming on and doing this. In about a month, we'll do numbers. And then after that, we're gonna have Deuteronomy and we'll be done with the Pentateuch and we'll move on into Joshua. So everybody continue to stay tuned. Look forward to more. And once again, thank you all for watching. Don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe. Also, check us out at patreon.com/reason and theology if you would like to support us. Till next time, God bless.